"You're under arrest, sir." He didn't react, didn't blink, didn't ask why. As the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, he kept his chin steady, eyes fixed ahead like he was still following orders only he could hear. Inside the courtroom, the sound of bored murmurs filled the space. A few smirks. Someone stifled a laugh. A young juror leaned over to whisper something that made her neighbor snort. To them, he was just another washed-up veteran, too old to cause real damage, too proud to let things go. But the man standing silently in shackles had once done something only one person alive could testify to. And that man, 4 stars on his chest, was already heading for the courthouse. The courthouse looked more like a forgotten town hall than a place of judgment. 2 levels. Brick walls faded by sun, wedged between an empty storefront and a dentist's office with taped windows. By sunrise, the lot was filling up. Most had no clue what the hearing was about. But reporters had caught wind of something unusual. And unusual is enough to get cameras unpacked. The charges were dull on paper. A squabble at a local fueling station. An argument between an older man and someone half his age. No blade, no bruises, no gun. Just the younger one claiming the other made a threat rooted in combat experience. That should have ended the case. But it didn't. Why? Because the older man said nothing. Not to the officer, not to the judge, not even to his court-appointed lawyer. He simply arrived. On time, alone, in a clean shirt and boots that had seen too much earth. People began to speculate. Guy's probably not all there. He's holding on to something he shouldn't be. Dangerous mix, military background and a short fuse. One columnist gave him a label. Unstable ex-service member with unresolved trauma. No one pulled his file. No one checked his record. No one asked. Most assumed he was another ghost from the system. Another man in camo who never found his way back. He lived outside town, near the edge of the tree line. A dented trailer. No Wi-Fi. No mailbox. Sometimes kids would dare each other to knock on his door. None ever made it past the gate. Neighbors saw him on his morning walks. Back unbent. Steps timed like drills. Wearing the same worn boots every single day. They didn't speak to him. They spoke about him. Weird guy. Something's off. Bit scary, that one. But none of them ever asked what he'd done, what he'd given, who he'd saved. His name? Typed in size 12 font on a docket, clipped beside minor offenses and noise complaints. But 30 miles away, a black SUV sliced through back roads, sirens off, lights off. Inside it, a man who owed that veteran his breath. And this time, someone in that courtroom was finally going to learn why. Name: Daniel Rigg. Age: 66. Former branch: U.S. Marine Corps. That's all the case file offered. No decorations, no citations. No footnotes about wars survived or men saved. And to most people in the courtroom, that single line was enough. The public defender assigned to him hadn't pressed for more. She'd asked a few questions before the hearing. Soft ones. The kind you toss out when you already know no one's listening. He gave little in return. No family on file, no friends listed, no one waiting in the gallery. He didn't seem angry. He didn't seem afraid either. He just seemed finished. When they brought him in, the cuffs were already snug, but he didn't fight them. Didn't glance at the bailiff, didn't acknowledge the stares. His gaze fixed on the floor, unreadable but not defeated. Behind the defense table, the back row filled with town gossip and assumption. Isn't that the guy who shouted at a teen in the parking lot? No, I think he threatened someone, probably snapped from all that war trauma. Bet he sleeps with one eye open. They said it loud enough to be heard, but not loud enough to be quoted. People always want to whisper what they wouldn't dare defend. Then the judge entered. Everyone stood. The trial began. And it moved like something already decided. Witness after witness came forward, each one unsure, indirect. The convenience store clerk said he seemed off. A woman mentioned overhearing a threat, something about knowing how to kill. The alleged victim wore a neck brace but didn't touch it once. He told the jury he felt genuinely endangered by the look in the veteran's eyes. When asked to recall the exact threat, he paused for effect. He said he could take me out from 800 yards. Clean. No hesitation. Gasps rolled like a ripple. The courtroom shifted in their seats. The defense stayed silent. Daniel Rigg didn't flinch. He looked at no one. The prosecutor rose, full of rhythm and confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this man once wore a uniform, yes. But that was long ago. And what stands before us now is not a soldier, but someone who uses history like a weapon." He let that settle. He's not a hero. He's a hazard. He doesn't protect. He intimidates. This isn't about honor, it's about threat. Some jurors nodded. Others looked away. The defender didn't stand, didn't rebut. Maybe she had already surrendered too. The judge gave instructions, monotone and brief. The bailiff escorted Daniel toward the holding corridor. Whispers trailed behind him like smoke. Cameras flashed, and outside, no one noticed the black SUV pulling to the curb. Inside it sat a man with a posture that spoke of command. He wore pressed military dress, ribbons aligned like precision itself. On his collar, 4 silver stars. In his hand, a printed docket. His eyes scanned one line: Daniel Rigg. And as the jury room door clicked shut with a low metallic thud, the officer stepped out. Not to pose for headlines, not to be seen, but to speak the truth that no one in that courtroom even knew existed. The judge stayed seated, but didn't leave. She pretended to read her notes, but her eyes barely moved. Everyone could feel it. The outcome was already written. She was just waiting for it to arrive. Daniel Rigg sat alone, hands folded on the table. Chain still looped through his belt, even though the cuffs had been removed. He hadn't spoken, hadn't fidgeted, hadn't flinched. He looked like a man who understood exactly how this would end, and wasn't interested in rewriting it. To the left, the defense attorney clicked away at her keyboard, more to fill the silence than to finish anything. Across the aisle, the prosecutor scrolled his phone, one corner of his mouth lifted in smug satisfaction. The jury was gone. The tension wasn't. Outside the double doors, something was happening. A single photo from inside the courtroom had hit the local feeds, the kind that goes viral when no one expects it to. Cameras started arriving. Tripods appeared. A few familiar faces from the military community stood in clusters at the edge of the parking lot, watching, waiting. They hadn't been called. They hadn't been asked. But they came. Because when something feels wrong, soldiers don't need a summons. Then, without lights or attention, a black vehicle pulled up to the curb. No police markings, no escort, no introduction. The man who stepped out wore a suit that still fit like a uniform, shoulders square, steps precise. And on his collar, 4 silver stars. General Samuel Wyatt, retired head of special operations. Most civilians wouldn't know the name. But the clerk at the front desk sat straighter as soon as he saw him. The security guard waved him through without a single question. "Courtroom 3?" the general asked, low voice, controlled tone. He didn't wait for an escort. Inside, no one yet realized the atmosphere was about to shift. Daniel hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken since he arrived. He barely blinked. But the second the courtroom doors creaked open and the general stepped through, the room changed. The judge froze. Reporters turned. The prosecutor straightened slowly, brows tight with confusion. General Wyatt walked forward, not to the bench, not to the press gallery, not toward authority. He walked straight to the man in the worn shirt and scarred hands. To Daniel Rigg. And Daniel finally looked up. For the first time. Their eyes locked. No salute. No handshake. No words yet. But something passed between them. Something no one else in that courtroom could touch. The judge, still standing, cleared her throat. "Sir, may I ask your purpose here today?" The general turned from Daniel to the bench. His hands stayed behind his back. "I'm here as a witness," he said, voice smooth but full of steel. "Not for the court's convenience. For the truth." He turned again, not to the jury, not to the press, but to Daniel. "This man," Wyatt said, "did something most of you will never understand. But you're about to." No one moved. No one breathed. Whatever verdict was waiting, It just got rewritten. "I'm not here on request," the general began. "No one called me. No one asked. Least of all him." He gestured toward Daniel with a nod so subtle it could have been missed. "He doesn't know I came. In fact, I'm sure he'd prefer I hadn't." His voice was calm, level, but every word felt like a hammer wrapped in velvet. "I came because the man you've accused is the reason I'm still breathing." The prosecutor shifted in his seat, suddenly stiff. Reporters leaned in. A juror returning from the hallway froze, one foot inside the room, the other unsure. This wasn't the case she left behind 5 minutes ago. Something had changed. Wyatt stepped closer to the bench, not to intimidate, but to testify. His tone was quiet, but every syllable landed like truth stripped of decoration. 31 years ago, I was pinned down in Fallujah. My unit was scattered, 2 men bleeding out, and radio silence had cut us off completely. We had no cover, no air support, nothing but a crumbling wall and a prayer. He paused. You could hear someone's watch ticking. Then, from nowhere, one man, one rifle, opened a way out. He didn't shout. He didn't wait for orders. He just did what had to be done. Wyatt scanned the faces in front of him. 12 confirmed hits, no misses, each one surgical. The last, through a rooftop hatch at 936 yards, moving target, heavy crosswind. A low gasp swept through the gallery. That shot, Wyatt continued, saved my life, and the lives of every man on that mission. He took a step back, his voice never rising, only deepening. The man behind that scope was Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Rigg. A ripple of murmurs surged, but Wyatt raised one hand. The room obeyed. I've reviewed your transcripts. I've seen the charge. And I'm telling you, if this man muttered a threat, it wasn't anger. It was memory. It was the shadow of someone who's seen what real violence looks like, and chose not to use it. He turned toward the bench. With your permission, Your Honor, I'd like to address the jury. The judge nodded, still stunned. Wyatt moved slowly toward the jury box. No podium. No notes. Do you know why he hasn't defended himself? He asked. It's not because he's guilty. It's because he's exhausted. Exhausted from explaining that silence doesn't mean danger. That standing still doesn't mean you're a threat. That the ones who've seen the worst are often the quietest in the room. He let the moment breathe. When chaos breaks out, when it's real, when it's deadly, you want a man like him beside you. Not for what he'll say, but for what he'll do. Wyatt exhaled. You don't chain men like that. You honor them. Then, in front of the bench, the press, the jurors, and the man who had once pulled him out of death's grip, General Wyatt lowered himself to one knee. Not as a gesture, not for a headline, but as a reckoning. For a system that had failed to remember who its protectors really were. No one moved. Not the bailiff, not the judge, not even the prosecutor, whose confidence now cracked across his face like shattered porcelain. The jury, who had just begun to re-enter, stood frozen mid-step. All eyes were locked on the sight they never imagined they'd witness. A 4-star general kneeling at the feet of the man they were moments from convicting. One juror wiped his face quickly. Another sank lower in her chair, unable to meet Daniel Rigg's gaze. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then hesitated. There was nothing left to say. Nothing left that wouldn't sound hollow. At the center of it all, Daniel hadn't shifted. No expression, no triumph, no vindication. His eyes, heavy with memory, stayed on the general. And then, slowly like a motion pulled from the past, he stood. The chains still hung from his belt, but his steps were steady. He walked to the general, extended his hand. General Wyatt rose and took it, and in that moment, time seemed to hold its breath. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. It wasn't a handshake. It was recognition. 2 men, not as sniper and commander, not as accused and rescuer, but as brothers carved from the same battlefield, bound by a silence the world had always misunderstood. The judge leaned forward, her voice softer than before. In light of this testimony, and the extraordinary circumstances brought before this court, she paused, her fingers trembling slightly. I hereby dismiss all charges, effective immediately. The gavel didn't crash. It landed like the closing of a chapter. Daniel's chains were removed. This time, the bailiff's hands moved slower. Respectful, unsure. No one touched him with authority. Only with care. Daniel didn't rush the exit. He turned, gave the jury a nod. Not of gratitude, but grace. Then walked the aisle with the slow gravity of a man whose story had waited far too long to be heard. Each footstep echoed across the wood-paneled walls like the end of a war no one knew had still been going. Outside, the sunlight was harsh, but Daniel didn't squint. He walked through it like someone remembering how to feel warmth again. On the courthouse steps, a group of veterans stood. Not in formation, not in ceremony, just present. One raised a salute. No one told him to. Daniel kept walking. Past the reporters, past the murmurs, past the questions that never needed answers. He didn't speak, he never had to. Behind him, General Wyatt followed, not as a shield, not as a protector, but as a witness. And for the first time in years, Daniel Rigg didn't look like a ghost who had wandered too far from his war. He looked like a man still standing because he never gave up on quiet strength. Heroes don't always march. They don't always speak. Sometimes they just endure. Sometimes they walk into a courtroom in scuffed boots and leave without a word, not for lack of something to say, but because they spent a lifetime doing what mattered when no one was watching. Some people spend their lives trying to be seen. Daniel Rigg spent his avoiding it, not because he was hiding, but because he knew recognition doesn't always come with understanding, and when it does come, it's often too late to matter. But this time, someone saw him before the world forgot him again. As the gavel landed and the chains were lifted, Daniel didn't flinch. No dramatic breath. No sigh of relief. He moved like a man who never asked for mercy in the first place. The courtroom was still. Not out of shock, but out of shame. The jury returned to their seats, some red-eyed, others refusing to look at him. They'd nearly condemned a man they didn't bother to learn about. A man whose silence had once saved lives, and now nearly cost him his freedom. Daniel didn't glare. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded, once, and walked past the people who had just learned how wrong they'd been. Reporters hovered at the doors, microphones trembling in their hands, but none of them had the courage to speak. How do you ask questions when you're the reason no one listened sooner? Outside, the sun had finally pierced through the gray. But Daniel walked like a man still carrying rain inside him. He didn't pause at the cameras. He didn't slow down for headlines. He just kept moving, each step measured like he was still navigating a minefield. Veterans lined the steps. Some saluted, others bowed their heads. Not out of duty. Out of recognition. Daniel gave them nothing more than the same quiet he always had. And they understood. That's what makes men like him different. They don't perform. They remember. General Wyatt walked a few steps behind. Not leading, not protecting, following. Not every act of bravery happens on a battlefield. Some happen in fluorescent courtrooms, with a tired man and a truth that took 3 decades to surface. Daniel Rigg wasn't free because a judge said so. He was free because finally someone had the strength to kneel when it mattered. And that's the part most people forget. Bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a nod across a room. A hand that doesn't shake. A stare that says, I was there, and I remember. He returned home to the trailer no one thought twice about. The same crooked fence. The same rusted mailbox. But inside, something had changed. Not the furniture. Not the peeling wallpaper. The silence had shifted. Because now, the world outside that door could no longer say they didn't know who he was. Daniel poured himself a cup of black coffee. No sugar. No cream. Same as always. And as the sun spilled through the blinds, he sat at the small wooden table. Dog tags on the wall. Boots by the door. And a folded note sent later that week from a juror, unsigned, that read, I'm sorry we didn't ask who you were before we judged you. He folded it once, placed it in a drawer, and never mentioned it again. Because forgiveness wasn't something he needed. Only clarity. The headlines faded after a week. The clips stopped being shared. People moved on, like they always do. But not everyone. Some remembered. The ones who saw him walking before dawn, boots crunching along gravel roads, posture still perfect. The ones who whispered his name with reverence now instead of rumor. And in homes across the country, other veterans, forgotten, overlooked, watched that courtroom footage and knew one of them had been seen. And maybe that meant they might be next. Because when General Wyatt dropped to one knee, he wasn't just honoring a man. He was correcting a nation's memory. And that matters. Because justice doesn't always look like a courtroom victory. Sometimes it looks like one man standing still until someone else finds the courage to kneel beside him. This story is part of Veterans' Voice. If you know someone who's never asked for attention but deserved the world, drop their story in the comments. Let their silence be honored. And if you believe quiet heroes should never be forgotten, subscribe. Because not all battles happen in war. Some happen in daylight, right in front of us, when we choose to listen.